Hello, fair listeners. Ike and I are hard at work on our 1-year anniversary episode. So this week we bring you a classic episode from the archive, the very first public episode of the Underpowered Hour. What a difference a year can make. We hope you enjoy this travel back in time, and we'll see you next week. It's the Underpowered Hour. On today's show, Canadian market Land Rovers, more new Defenders in the US than old NAS ones, Iniose breeds an Issuzu Tropper with a Land Rover Defender, and the Land Rover Classic Works. And now, here's the show. Welcome to the Underpowered Hour. I'm Stephen Barris, mild-mannered television executive by day and Land Rover collector by night. You can find out more about my cars and what we're working on at thebarriscollection.com or check us out on Instagram at thebarriscollection. I'm joined, as always, by my good friend, Ike Goss.
Hi, I'm Stephen Barris's friend, Ike Goss, and I operate a Land Rover shop, Pangolin 4x4, in today, cloudy Oregon.
Oh, it's too bad. You know, it was supposed to be crazy rainy down here in beautiful Southern California over the last 2 weeks, and I've been driving the Defender around because it's strangely the most waterproof car I have, which is, I think, saying something about the general seaworthiness of my fleet. But we really didn't get much. Now, of course, the East Coast is under like 92 feet of snow or something, and there's snowboarding off the side of the, of the Sears Tower. But we didn't really get much down here. How about, but you guys are rainy up there, or it's just Oregon?
It's intermittent. Yeah, it's this time of year you've got sun, and it's simultaneously raining. So you have the rainbow. It's rainbow season.
It's rainbow season.
It's rainbow season, which is fine. Man. I like rainbows.
It's just, who doesn't love rainbows? It's sort of a sun rain, a slain, if you will. It's slain season.
So let's talk a little bit more about the water tightness of your fleet, which you had mentioned.
Yeah, so I did a while back, and you've seen my Defender, which is a NAS Defender, a 94 model in 93 build year NAS Defender that was originally a soft top, because in Canada, we didn't get the fancy hard tops because, of course, Canada's climate is known for our love of convertible vehicles, seeing as we have, 5.5 days of warm weather a year. What wouldn't you want on your car but a roof? And so I actually got a roof that was originally from a Wolf Defender from the Canadian Forces out by Medicine Hat, and retrofit that sucker over top of my NAS safety devices roll cage, which required stripping off the don't bump your head padding, which whenever I say that to somebody who is far more precious about the constitution of their NAS Land Rovers than I am, turns them a deep shade of white. Like they throw up in their mouth a little bit, and are just so awestruck that I would have stripped away the collectible padding around the outside of my roll cage. That
padding is extremely valuable and frequently dictates the value of the entire vehicle because it's like irreplaceable foam.
Yeah, it is an irreplaceable foam. That, at the time, I don't know that I was thinking that I would keep this vehicle forever. Of course, now, I would never sell it. It's one of those things my daughter will have to deal with when I die, amongst, let's be honest, a whole warehouse full of crap.
Probably a list of stuff that...
Yeah, I don't even think it's high on the list, quite frankly. I mean, you've got, that poor girl is going to have to deal with so much garbage when I die. But you know what? That's what you get. Tough luck. It's probably the most seaworthy because it has had a roof fitted by someone outside of the UK and spent some time, sort of sealing it up.
So I found your description of Canadian market Defenders interesting because it's kind of the opposite of what Land Rover started to do when they began making vehicles for the Canadian market, which is everyone was a hardtop, and they decided that the doors didn't need to be split in two because, there's like polar bears and whatnot. So you would never take the door tops off.
Right.
And so they made one-piece doors for the Series Land Rovers that were made in the Canadian market, starting with Series 1s and then continuing with Series 2s. And then I think they stopped doing it in the Series 3s.
And those didn't have crankdown windows, right? Those were still slidey windows, but just without the divider that allowed you to unbolt it from the bottom of the door.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. They still had sliding windows, but it was now just a one-piece frame, and you couldn't separate the top from the bottom.
I mean, that makes a lot more sense. I think, with the NAS trucks, they tried to kind of compete with the Jeep of the day, sort of Jeep, Wrangler, TJ, whatever they were at the day. And I don't know that it necessarily addressed the same market. Maybe in California, I think, they were probably very popular here because you had the opportunity to take the top off and drive around like that. And then funny enough, the United States, of course, did get hard tops. Of course, they got the 110 as well as a 90 in hard top that Canada never got. The one country that could really use a hard top. We never got them. We only got them the 1 year.
Well, I can't sure. I'm not sure I know how to explain their thinking on that, but that is interesting.
Yeah. No, and, there was so many great years of Land Rovers in Canada way early on, Series 1, Series 2, and Series 3. Great cars that came into Canada and tons of them around. They're everywhere. And... yeah, it was just weird that I think the Defender there had been too long of a gap, I think, since the time they sold a series vehicle in Canada and to the time they sold the Defender.
Well, obviously had a huge British influence initially, and certainly British Columbia was a huge market for Land Rovers. They were used for municipal purposes, logging, and they sold a lot of them. But that obviously changed over time, and I'm not sure at what point they were like, this is not a utility vehicle we need. Do you know more about that?
Well, I think at some point in the 80s, everything kind of transitioned to maybe even probably earlier than that, obviously the 70s, because the Rovers were gone for the most part by the 80s. They had transitioned to sort of Ford and Chevrolet or General Motors equivalents, heavy air quotes there, obviously, but most of the municipal vehicles were some form of, if they were maybe a forestry service vehicle, they were going to be something like a Jimmy or that equivalent, right? Something, maybe a Ford Bronco, but probably realistically more like pickup trucks. I think they converted largely the forestry service over to what was probably F-150s and Silverados and things of the 80s with boxes on the back of them. I remember all of the forestry service people that would tell us we can't camp wherever it was that we were camping would always show up in a, vintage Ford kind of pickup truck with the Canadian the Park Service or whatever logo on the side of it. And, I don't even really remember. I mean, I've obviously seen pictures and some of them up in the national park in Banff where I'm from that area. They still had some of the older cars, but yeah, I don't know. British Columbia, you're right, way more popular. Also out east in Ontario and stuff, there was a ton of, because of the logging industry, I think, not so much in Alberta, but in BC and in Ontario, ton more.
Well, that actually brings up a good point, which is something interesting. Land Rover as a utility vehicle and their utility market kind of diminished, throughout the late 60s and early 70s. And they began obviously producing more upmarket cars, the Range Rover most notably. So, I know there was a lot of labor strikes in that time period. And I think that Land Rover as a company did not have the production capacity. They lost a lot of their production capacity at that time and never fully recovered. So they were kind of presented with a situation, sort of an either or. Do we pursue these upmarket, more luxury vehicles, or do we pursue our more traditional utility markets? And they couldn't really handle both.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I guess it's sort of the Range Rover killed the radio star to a certain extent, right? I mean, once they got traction with the Range Rover, and then later on, I think the Discovery as well, which both came in like weird utility versions. Like I love a Range Rover ambulance or like a Range Rover police car. Like they're super cool, 2-door Range Rover fire trucks, which sort of seems like an odd combo, but they're the coolest looking, and what an interesting car, but obviously the core market was consumers, luxury, sort of became more and more of a thing. Even though, I was going to, my Classic is still quite luxurious. It has rear passenger door side armrests. What other car has armrests that flip down on either side of you in the back seat? It's, you're like the queen back there.
Can you imagine that just someone saying, passengers get their arms tired too.
Exactly. Her Majesty needs a place for both arms, not just the center sharing arm. But no, I mean it's a neat car, and you think about how kind of technological maybe, but certainly luxury wise, how advanced it was for the time it came out. I mean, even the old 2-doors, they're super nice inside, and they are way less utility than the Land Rover that is contemporary to them, right? I mean, you look at you think about the first 2-door Range Rovers right around the same time the late Series 2As or early Series 3s are coming out, and they're like, it's like a completely different car. Like it's so much nicer. It's just interesting that, and that happened to be the way that things broke. And maybe, I don't know, maybe do you think it's because it's a newer manufacturing platform that all the labor required to put a series truck together compared to, I'm sure, what is more modern manufacturing that went into the first Range Rover and then subsequent Range Rovers? They're probably just easier to make. Maybe. I don't know.
I think that's true. I think that certainly a lot of the earlier vehicles, there's a lot of handmade content, and we kind of touched on that in our first episode, or a pilot, if you will. Mm-hmm. The new Defender is made to be produced in large numbers, whereas the old Defender wasn't, and that's certainly reflected in their production numbers. That there's so much handwork in those cars, so many individual pieces. It's difficult to scale that up unless you can scale up your workforce. And certainly the number of drunk Englishmen, surprisingly, has diminished over time.
Yeah, which doesn't stand to... It doesn't make sense, right? That, but you're right. I think that, the folks that were making Defender at the end of the run there, I mean, it wasn't an army of people. There were a few folks, I think that the whole labor force, I don't know how many it was, but wasn't more than a few hundred. And yeah, it would take them forever to make one of those cars. And it was, still made on a modern production line and everything, and it would get painted as a set and all that sort of stuff. And they'd drop in the, that Ford source TDCI motor and stuff. And it was a little bit, but still, I mean, man, between, and you've said it before, setting panel gaps to spot welding on hood, tabs for the high cap pickups and stuff. It's just everything was so manual. Still, in 2016, they weren't made that much differently than they were making cars in the 60s and 70s.
No, you watch those kind of promotional films of them sort of wrapping up the end of Defender production, and they roll out some of those old guys who used to work on the production line. I think that's really theater. Those guys still worked on the production line, and that was just them finishing their careers working on the last Defenders.
Yeah, that's right. They're then taken out to the jungle track and allowed to die.
They're made into part of the jungle track.
The jungle track. They grow into a tree, sort of like an aged sage. Yeah, no, I mean, it was really interesting, and I don't know. You've seen the Grenadier thing, right? This project that essentially aims to sort of recreate some of the, I think some of the feeling of the Defender, and probably maybe even improve on the off-road capability, but I don't know that it's the same sort of a thing. It's interesting. It kind of looks like if a Geländewagen and a Defender, sort of met on a torrid weekend getaway.
I like to look at it as an Isuzu Trooper. and a Defender were combined due to that split rear door arrangement that the Trooper is somewhat famous for.
Yeah.
But that I think is an Iniose product. Mr. Ratcliffe is in charge of that, and is hoping to make a vehicle that he claims is more in keeping with the original design than maybe what the new generation Defender is.
Right.
But that's obviously a matter of opinion. Mm-hmm. If I was going to say, see a vehicle that was more in keeping with the original, I would picture a short wheelbase soft top, which is kind of the opposite of what they have made.
Yeah, right.
Which is a long wheelbase wagon. At least that's the variant that I've seen. But I think it's also getting a lot of technical work by Magnastair, who I think is the next generation of Steyr Puch, famous for building the Pinzgauers and Haflingers.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, and it's made in Slovakia, I think. So it's kind of got this, interesting pedigree. A lot of influences from Germany and from England. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool. I wonder. I don't know. I mean, if it's $200,000 or even $150,000, even $100,000, quite frankly, I don't know how much traction it's going to get. I mean, Geländewagens sell out their production line, I believe, more or less. The G-Wagon sells out more or less every year of their production of no matter how absurd they make a variant, the portal axled version and things like that. They still sell them all. Mercedes is still able to sell them all at, of course, an absurdly high price tag. And it was often said, well, if Land Rover made a Defender, the original Defender in a modern way, it would cost $200,000, and they could only make X number of them a year, which is, I guess, just what Mercedes has said. And I mean, Mercedes, unlike BMW, will make models that they only sell a super, super small number of. The Maybach edition of the limousine style, the full-on Maybach that they made for a little while, and then now the Maybach edition of the big, I think they make dozens of those a year. There's only so many princes in Saudi Arabia that need, new luxury limousines every year, so they don't, they only make so many of them. But it's interesting. They're a giant manufacturer that does these low-volume car things. I just don't think JLR, unless it was maybe something they did through the Classic Works or something, could really do that. They're not set up to do that kind of stuff.
Well, I think they tried recently to make something like that with the Defender Works V8.
Yeah.
They produced a low-volume, high-performance, classic-looking four-wheel drive, and I can't remember exactly how they did those, but my understanding is they had reserved a certain number of VINs that were, classic, quote-unquote, classic production cars, and then they built the cars into Works V8s, so they were really, really technically older vehicles, like 2017s or something like that. Yeah. And then they made this high performance edition. So I think they've tried that, but in terms of scaling that up and doing something like a Geländewagen, again, I think it goes back to their production capacities. Land Rover is kind of in this interesting middle zone where, they're not really a entirely niche producer like a Koenigsegg or something like that, where they're only making a few cars a year, but they're also not a Toyota or a Mercedes. Right. So, they're limited in their production capacity, and to tool up for a small number of cars like that is probably unrealistic. Yeah. But we can hope, we can dream.
Well, and they started, down the road of producing that two-door Range Rover, which I thought was so cool. Like a modern Range Rover, but two-door, like absurdly two doors. I think it was, the crazy reclining rear, sort of Learjet seats and things, like really, really far out there, like a concept car that was for sale essentially, and they were going to make, I don't know, a dozen of them or something. And unfortunately, it didn't hit because I think there was too much, financial strife and other things that just trying to make that car would be impossible. But it would be interesting to see things like that. There's a market for them, small, obviously very small. I wonder, do you think there's a bigger market for doing the classic sort of restoration projects? That seems to be all the rage now, not just Land Rover, obviously, but, Aston Martin, I think, famously is doing this Goldfinger DB5, where not only is it like a handmade DB5, which I think is cool, but it's got all the Bond gadgets built into it. And I think they're £2.5 million, or maybe it's £5 million. I don't know. It's some astronomical number.
At a certain point, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's right. And it really is, because I don't believe it's road legal. So at some point, it doesn't matter, because you're not going to drive it on the street. It's a toy to have at the house, at the cottage, the summer cottage, whatever, right? And so, but it's interesting that, like, the rebuilding or the restoring or the continuation of these classic cars seems to be really popular. I think Porsche's doing it. Mercedes is doing it. BMW is doing it. Obviously, Land Rover is doing it. Aston Martin, and I'm sure if you look at any company, they're doing it, or they've got something in the works. I mean, maybe not, Ford and Toyota and stuff. Although Ford actually has a really interesting custom, more race muscle car kind of program. But they even do very custom tuning, very custom work for for the Ford Mustang and the Ford GT cars, obviously things like that. So it's interesting that manufacturers are looking at their history, these cars that people loved, and instead of doing what I'm sure, a lot of marketing and salespeople are probably saying, we got to look forward at the models that we're going to sell a bunch of. That's where we should be focusing. That there's this sense of, well, no, actually the history, these vintage cars that, like, listen, we're going to sell several dozen of them, but the aspiration of owning those cars, of those cars being around, seeing them at things, just gets excitement around the brand. It pushes the brand forward.
Well, totally. And, everybody's nostalgic to a certain extent, especially car people. And so it makes sense for these companies to look back, hey, what were our successes, and let's celebrate those in a way that makes people feel special. And the more special people feel, the more they're willing to spend money to feel that way. So I think it makes sense. And, certainly it gets people talking about the brand. And for those of us who work with the classic cars on a regular basis, it gets people excited about those, because, again, that's not something they can do in, large numbers. You can't really produce a handmade, whether it's a DB5 or a early 356 or whatever. You can't produce them or restore them in large numbers. Just not scalable. There's too much labor involved.
Yeah, and even the restoration cars. I mean, you can only find so many Series 1s for the Classic Works to restore, right? There's only so many around that are even candidates for it. And again, I think there's probably more around than there are people who are willing to pay the amount for it. I mean, I don't know if it's an indication of the success of that program, but of course, the first one that the Classic Works restored recently sold at auction, because the owner of that car obviously got into some dubious business, and those cars were auctioned as part of a settlement. But it 250 some odd $1,000 or something, right? I mean, something in that ballpark, right? A doubling and some of the initial price of about $90,000, I think. So it's a good indication that, I guess, the sort of factory restoration, the factory continuation sort of things do in fact have some value and are something that people seem to want to collect, which I think is good. So.
Well, if you look at the labor involved in those cars and the amount of effort that has gone into researching and building them, it definitely exceeds their price tag. It's one thing to make a production car at $90,000. It's entirely different to restore and build by hand a car and sell it at $90,000. That's not something that is, you're going to make money doing, especially for a car company like Land Rover. So, I mean, honestly, those are undervalued cars, and there's a limited number of them. So I don't expect them to diminish in value. And like you said, there's only a certain number, while there may be a larger number of cars that are technically surviving, there's a smaller number of cars that are really worthy of restoring to that level.
Yeah, I agree. And just to see, I mean, that obviously, the Classic Works in Oxfordshire is amazing, right? I mean, it's part of the sort of special vehicles, new special vehicles complex, which looks like it was supposed to be a distribution center or something that like didn't end up working as a distribution center. So they figured something else for it. I don't know if that was the landlord or if it was Land Rover, but also where they house all of their collection of crazy Land Rovers over the years that aren't at the British Motor Heritage Museum. But yeah, I think it's interesting, right? I mean, it's one extra facet of things. I don't know that my taste is insane because I am fixated on doing the majority of it myself, and then when that doesn't work, I'll send it to you. But I think most people, are not able to necessarily do the research that's necessary to find an Ike Goss to go through and make a masterpiece restoration. Whereas, you go to the factory, if you will, and I think there's a certain assumption that it's going to be a very high quality. And in the case of Classic Works, it is. It's extraordinary. And the stuff that the Jaguar guys are doing with the D types and the and the ultraweight E types, it's crazy. I mean, it's amazing. They're pieces of art, obviously, that just happen to take gasoline and drive around. But yeah, it's interesting. Anyways.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful. It's good for the brand. It's good for enthusiasts. It inspires people to do their own restorations, even if they're not of the ilk that can afford to spend $100,000 plus on a restoration. Gets them inspired to do their own. And gets people excited about driving the cars and using them. And in addition to doing the series cars, they're doing Range Rovers too. They're vacuum forming the original type seats for those cars, and there's a lot that goes into the Range Rover, and those cars are another level expensive just because they're more complicated and they use production methods that aren't necessarily available traditionally outside of a production environment. Like, it's not just like some guy restitching seats. You have to make these molds and build a lot of infrastructure to make some of those pieces, the dashboards and the other pieces that make up those early cars. That's not something that you would normally be able to make in your garage.
Yeah, exactly.
Unlike the series cars, you could technically restore a lot of that in your garage.
Yeah, I mean, I think a portion of the parts that we replace, not a huge portion, but a portion of them are parts that we make. We've started to get into the 3D printing of at least masters for things like, the little rubber feet for underneath the roof rack, where, had to scan an original part, and it's still iterating, not quite there yet. But that's a production, that's a piece that having to produce that at any volume is extremely expensive. It had to be injection molded rubber or whatever. It's got to be vulcanized, all that sort of stuff. That's not achievable for, even, to be fair, a low volume production run is extraordinarily expensive. So some of these methods, even if it's not necessarily the manufacturing, but just the ability to scan a piece and get a really dimensionally accurate model of the original piece, and then be able to send that out to either 3D printing or, even 3D positive printing for the purpose of making molds out of it or whatever. I mean, that technology has now become something that, you need an iPhone and a little bit of time and some knowledge of how to properly light things and do photogrammetry and that sort of stuff. But you can do it, and you get really exceptional results. And I think that's another level where we get to, in the next 5 to 10 years, being able to print in different types of metals, and being able to essentially reproduce a single part that is, for the most part, maybe visually difficult to differentiate from the original, and at some point, probably functionally impossible to differentiate from the original, and maybe even better, right? Maybe you're making something, it used to be a cast part that, was sand cast in the 1940s, and now you're able to 3D print it by some metal fusion 3D printing, and now that's very expensive, but soon it won't be, and you'll get a part that's actually better. It's going to work better. It's going to, that particular, mount for an alternator for a car that doesn't exist anymore, an engine block that was very low number or something like that, being able to reproduce those parts parts without having to try to find one that just simply may not exist. That is very cool. I think that's a really interesting place to look going forward.
No, I think that's really exciting for restoring older automobiles. The ability to find some of these pieces that, because of their low numbers or the lack of survival, that are very difficult for enthusiasts to get a hold of. It's going to make a whole another group of vehicles, not just Land Rovers, possible to restore.
Yeah.
Some of that early Japanese stuff is really hard to get parts for. Mm-hmm. People are really excited about those cars, but they're hard to live with because, you can't get parts for them. But if you can make parts in the near future, I see the value of those cars really increasing. And parts availability is really what drives enthusiasts and drives the enthusiast car market. If you've got an old car, it's hard to be really excited about it if you can't drive it or fix it. So parts availability is huge, and that's one of the great things about old Land Rovers is compared to a lot of their contemporaries, parts are pretty easy to get.
Oh man, yeah. No, it is sort of embarrassing, actually, how much of it is available, how much you can get. I mean, not, obviously, and you and I know that well. Some of the old Series 1 stuff's a little tricky, getting it right, getting stuff that's well made. But if you're driving, like my almost daily driver, the Series 3, although it's sort of taken apart right now, but there's almost no part I can't get for it. Nothing that would keep it from running anyways. Certain little fiddly interior bits and things, maybe not. But certainly if it's a common, engine issue, something that's going to wear out, need replacement, it's 3 or 4 days away. It's not a difficult car to keep running and keep on the road. The Defender, obviously, classic Range Rovers, all those, from the 3.9 liter all the way up to the 4 and change liter Buick-based motors. Those cars share a lot of common parts with, American cars, American GM cars. So it's Buick cars. So it's not it's not a hard car to live with. To your point, it's they're actually pretty reasonable. So.
I think that's great, and that'll continue to drive enthusiasts towards those brands that are easy to live with, even as we continue to go into different types of engine conversions to meet, emissions regulations in certain places. If you can still get parts to make them look like an old car, I think people are going to continue to be excited about them, and that'll keep the values high and keep people excited about them and keep them driving them.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave off for today, and I think a great cliffhanger, preview of next week. I'd love to chat a little bit about what does electrification with, GM saying by 2035 every car they make is going to be electric. What does that mean for the enthusiast market? What does that mean for those of us with, Series Land Rovers that want to continue to drive them into the future, but also, know that fossil fuels aren't maybe great for the environment and aren't maybe going to be as plentiful as we look into the far future, obviously well past 2035 when there's some scarcity around that. What are your thoughts on that? So I'll leave you there. I can give that a mull over, and we can chat about that in the future. And perhaps there's there's an amazing revelation to be had there. I'm sure. Just hook up a Series 1 starter motor. Those things are the size of like an airplane starter motor. So that'll drive the whole car. Just continually hit the starter button, and it's all electric. Just put it in gear and you're off.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to the future. As long as I can drive a Land Rover, it'll be great.
Indeed. All right, sir. Until next time, we'll chat again soon.
Thanks, Stephen.
The Underpowered Hour is produced by me, Steve Barris, and Ike Goss. Pavel Svardov composed and performed our theme music. Consider supporting the show on Patreon, and if you already do, thank you. Your support makes the show possible. For even more, check out our Instagram or Facebook.